If you are thinking about rebranding and reinventing your personal brand, then make sure you consider the verbal identity of your personal brand, because the words that you choose to use don't just communicate their meaning, they communicate for your personal brand and what you represent. Today I want to share the tips that I share with some of my personal brand coaching clients. So grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. Now, if you have rebranding and reinventing yourself on your mind and you don't already follow this channel, then this is just part of a series that I am sharing on this topic. This is something that I have spoken about previously on this channel and something that I visited over the last couple of weeks when I discussed rebranding yourself online and rebranding and reinventing the visual identity of your personal brand. So after this episode, make sure that you check out those as well if you want to learn more about those particular topics. But for now, let's dive into tip number 1 of the 7 tips that I will share with you today. Tip number 1 is to read regularly and to read widely. You are who you spend your time with, and by reading books, it gives you a way to naturally expand your vocabulary and your knowledge and your interests. And so this gives you an opportunity to elevate and reinvent the verbal identity of your personal brand in ways that you may not actually get from your current relationships and your current social circles. Research has also compared the knowledge of TV watchers with readers, and readers have been shown to have increased knowledge, better analytical skills, and better judgment. And because things like books and magazines and other written texts often use more unique words than something like TV, it means that you have a chance to expand your vocabulary and your communication skills. So if you're not doing it already, consider regularly reading books, or maybe you might prefer blogs or articles or all of the above. And also consider if you can read across different areas of interest or different disciplines. The easiest way to become an interesting personal brand to other people is to be interested in different things. It makes you a more multi-dimensional person. But one thing that I will say as a caveat to that is that the best way to create strong relationships with people is not to get them to find you to be interesting, but to actually be genuinely interested in them. My tip number 2 is to listen and learn actively instead of passively. The learning pyramid compares active learning to passive learning, and reading is actually one of the most passive learning activities. The pyramid tells us that it only has a 10% retention rate. So when you move to turn your learning into more active activities, you improve your retention rate of your learning. You improve your return on investment for the time that you spent learning that thing. So don't just read or learn regularly and widely, but make sure you are turning those learning activities into an active activity. One of the ways that I've tried to do this more recently is to actually, when I am reading, take the time to learn words that I don't understand. So instead of just actually skipping over that and telling myself I'm not sure what that means and keep moving on, I'll actually take the time to pause, and because I read on ebooks, just with a couple of clicks, get the definition of what that word actually is. I've tried to develop more of that childlike curiosity that we have when we're young, and whenever we don't know something, we always ask, what does that mean? And so as adults, we tend to just skim past those things, I think, a little bit more. But when you actively engage in that process more, you have that opportunity to potentially expand your vocabulary and your communication skills. So whenever you're reading a book, an article, a blog, or maybe you're watching a video or listening to a podcast and you stumble across something that is unfamiliar to you, take the time to be curious and learn what that means. My tip number 3 to reinvent and rebrand your verbal identity for your personal brand is to create a list of captivating words. Energy flows where your attention goes. The more that you start to think about words, the more you will start to notice the choices that other people make more than ever. So whenever you are consuming any sort of communication, maybe you're listening to a podcast, maybe you're watching a video, maybe you're reading something, and you notice that certain words really pique your interest, they might spark a little bit more of an emotion in you, maybe they stand out from the rest of that about communication, then if that resonates with you, take the time to pop that on a list for yourself. This is what I do in a very simple way. I keep a list in my phone because I know it is something that I can access really easily at any time. I nearly always have it with me. So whenever I hear something or read something that resonates, I just add to that list. And I don't read that list every single day, but every so often when I'm skimming through my notes, or if I need a little bit more inspiration as to how to add a bit more personality to a communication, I will revisit that list, and with a very quick skim can get some inspiration for things that I can sprinkle through my own communication. For example, my late dad used to have a voicemail that ended in him saying, "Have a tremendous day." And my sister mentioned this in her eulogy for him, and she noted that it was so unique to say something like tremendous. That is how easy it can be to infuse your personality into your communication while still making sure that you are communicating simply and clearly. Because I want to be really clear that elevating your verbal communication or rebranding your communication should ideally have the focus on simplifying your communication more than trying to be overly complex just for the sake of sounding smart. The ultimate form of sophistication is to speak as simply as possible so that people can understand what you are communicating to them. But by changing just a few little words here and there, or adopting something that is a little bit more unique to you, that gives you a way to have your personality just stand out a little bit more and to express yourself in a way that you want to best represent yourself, as opposed to just communicating in this completely generic way that sounds just like everybody else. A few unique choices might be able to help you engage with your audience or in your relationships, and also add to your credibility. Research has shown that people that are perceived as articulate are also perceived as being more intelligent, competent, and educated. And those things could actually benefit your professional personal brand. For example, it could enhance perceptions of your leadership qualities, of your credibility, and of your persuasiveness. In The Unfair Advantage, Ash Ali and Hussein Kubas say, "Your status is your personal brand. It is how others see you. It is your social standing. Your appearance, gender, age, how you dress, stand, and talk. It's all your perceived credibility." My tip number 4 is to define your personal brand's verbal identity. Something that I get my personal brand coaching clients to do is to actually spend time refining their personal brand in terms of their verbal identity down to a few keywords. So if you had to, for example, define the verbal personal brand that you most want to represent in, say, 4 to 5 words, what would these be? And this is really similar to what a corporate brand would do. They refine down their brand identity into a few words so that it can help them to focus in on how they most want to communicate. And this is usually never about communicating in an inauthentic way, but bringing out those aspects of your brand that you most want to focus on, that you most want to start to amplify more in your communication. And by doing that, you start to dilute some of the verbal aspects of your personal brand that you don't want to necessarily form such a prominent part of your identity. One of the ways that I also suggest to take this to another level is that once you have your 4 or 5 words, to actually then also define what this looks like and what this doesn't look like. For example, if you want to sound more elegant as a part of your personal brand, then one of the things that you might put in what you don't want to do as much is maybe to, for example, excessively swear. You might define what the opposite of that thing could potentially look like. And there's no sort of right or wrong into what these things could be, and that is just one example. But it's just to get you to think about when you are acting on brand for the verbal brand that you want to have for yourself, and when you are potentially acting acting off brand for the verbal brand that you want to have for yourself. And you might like to do a little sense check of this through your communications. When I am leaving, for example, a particularly significant meeting, when I am walking away from that meeting, or when I'm commuting away from whatever that interaction was, I like to take the opportunity to just reflect on what some of those keywords were and ask myself if I represented myself in the best way possible relating to those words, or did I do more things that were going to be in more of the off-brand elements of the verbal personal brand that I would like to have. And of course, we're human beings and we are going to naturally fluctuate between being on brand for what we would like to do and being off brand in some cases too. This just gives you a little bit of a guide to ask yourself what the best representation or the ideal self of your personal brand could be. And of course, the tone of voice that you have is going to change in different contexts as well. So for example, you might have a particular tone of voice when it comes to you professionally, but you have a slightly different tone of voice when it comes to the after hours version of yourself. Now, of course, you don't want to necessarily have too much conflict between those things, because you want to make sure that in both of those settings that you are as authentic as you can be. But it's also a chance to say that in some situations, for example, if we go back to the excessive swearing example that I said earlier, in some situations, that might not necessarily be appropriate at all. Maybe you have a really professional job, you work in a really professional environment, and it's just not appropriate to have that sort of language. Maybe you are someone that interacts a lot with customers, and that absolutely wouldn't be appropriate in that setting. So it might just be understanding what that tone of voice looks like in different settings as well. Tip number 5 is to practice your desired personal brand verbal identity. If you were to do, for example, a one-off presentation that your boss asks you to do, then this is a great opportunity to elevate and improve your communication skills for the verbal aspect of your personal brand. But what if you were to do this much more regularly? What if you were to start a YouTube channel or a podcast, or engage in some sort of other activity that would allow you to constantly be improving and elevating the verbal identity of your personal brand? Maybe instead of just writing the monthly report that you're required to write as a part of your job, that you actually engage in regular writing as a hobby. Maybe you start your own blog, maybe you publish articles, maybe you're constantly refining your verbal personal brand through that hobby that you have, instead of just relying on the few opportunities where communicating in written form is actually required of you. And if we go back to my previous discussion on the learning pyramid, this is a way of moving from passive into active. For example, just by engaging in a discussion, then this increases retention to 50%. If you engage in the doing of that particular thing, then that increases retention to 75%. And at the highest level of that pyramid is the teaching, where retention increases to 90%. My tip number 6 is to measure your verbal brand. One of my favorite things about using Grammarly is that every week they send you a little report on your writing, and in that there is a section that relates to your tone of voice, and it has different dimensions that are ranking in your tone of voice, and it also shows you the metrics of shifts in that from previous weeks, so you can actually see how your tone of voice is coming across to other people in your communication. Another way that you could get an external perspective on your tone of voice is to put some of your communications into an AI platform like ChatGTP and ask it what the tone of voice is that it is detecting through your communication. And this will give you an understanding as to how your tone of voice is coming across to other people. My tip number 7 for your verbal personal brand is to, where possible, speak through another person's preferred language. In the book How to Talk to Anyone, Lel Lowndes talks about the importance of, when you are connecting with people, understanding what their preferred language is. And this relates to how people experience the world, and you'll be able to start to detect this in the way that they communicate. For example, if someone says that something looks good or something sounds good, then that gives you clues into their preferred language. Looks good is based on them being a visual person, whereas sounds good refers to them being more of an auditory person. So you can start to use similar language. To give you another example of how people might give you hints into the senses that they prefer to communicate through, they might say that they feel it in the air. They might say that they can smell it in the air, or they might say that they can taste it in the air. So start to keep an eye out for other people's preferred language, because this will enhance your opportunity to be able to connect with them and to build your rapport with them. This is a concept that is also reflected in neurolinguistics programming, which also asks you to recognize what other people's preferred system of communicating is, and understanding that we all have usually a dominant preference in that space. If you want to learn more about the specifics of rebranding and reinventing yourself, then check out my previous episode on rebranding and reinventing the visual identity of your personal brand. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.